Nobody told the planet it was supposed to be survivable. Solara had 2 suns. Not one like most worlds that had the decency to keep things simple. 2. They hung in the sky side by side, like the eyes of something enormous and ancient and completely indifferent to the small creatures moving around on the surface below. The light they produced together was not the soft, warm kind. It was the hard, flat kind that pressed down on everything like a hand and did not let up. By midday, the ground temperature reached levels that made the survey team's equipment casings expand slightly and click. The rocks were pale and sharp, and they reflected the light back upward so that even standing in the shadow of a boulder, you were still being cooked from below. The coalition had rated Solara as survivable and sealed suits for periods of up to 72 hours. Beyond that, the cumulative radiation load became a problem even through standard shielding. The survey mission had been planned for exactly 72 hours. Not 73. Commander Vale had checked the mission clock 4 times already, and the team had only been on the surface for 2 hours. He was Alrati, which meant he was tall and pale and had the particular, careful quality of a creature whose species had evolved in low-light conditions on a cold world and had therefore developed over many generations a deep biological distrust of anything that produced too much heat or brightness. Standing on Solara even inside a fully sealed radiation suit made something old and wordless in Vale want to go back inside the ship and close the door. He did not do this. He was a commander. He checked his suit readings and he walked his assigned survey quadrant, and he did his job. The team was spread across the survey grid in pairs. Dr. Fenn was working the Eastern Rock Formation with the youngest crew member, Sauce. The other 2 survey specialists were on the northern ridge, and Specialist Dana Reyes was working the Western Quadrant alone because she had asked to, and because her geological survey work was faster without a partner, and because Vale had learned in 3 months of working with her that Dana Reyes moved through difficult environments the way water moves through rock, which was quietly and without drama and always exactly where she intended to go. She was a human. She was the only human on the team. Vale had worked with humans before. Not many. Enough to know that they were interesting in ways that were hard to predict and occasionally alarming. They were medium-sized creatures with soft skin and no natural armor and no biological defenses that were visible, and yet they had this quality about them that Vale could only describe as unbothered. They encountered things that should have disturbed them, and they looked at those things with their flat, forward-facing eyes, and they said something dry and small and then kept moving. Dana was a very good example of this quality. She spent the first 2 hours of the surface survey mapping a geological fault line that ran through the Western Quadrant. She took samples. She logged readings. She photographed rock strata with the careful attention of someone who genuinely found rocks interesting, which Vale respected even if he did not fully understand it. She moved efficiently and without complaint, even though the terrain in the Western Quadrant was rough and the 2 suns were directly overhead, and her suit cooling system was working hard. Enough that he could hear it cycling in her cum channel when she spoke. What Vale did not know was that at the 40-minute mark, Dana's suit cooling system stopped working correctly. Not completely. Not in a dramatic way that would have triggered an automatic alert. The temperature regulation stayed functional. But the UV shielding layer in the suit had a secondary membrane that was supposed to filter out the specific high-frequency radiation that Solara's dual suns produced in quantities that made other planets look like desk lamps. That membrane had a small crack in the left sleeve seam. The crack was the width of a hair. It had probably been there since the last suit maintenance check and had been too small to flag in the automated inspection. Over 90 minutes of exposure. On the surface of Solara, that hair-width crack let in enough UV radiation to do something significant to the skin underneath. Dana noticed it at the 60-minute mark. She noticed because her forearms started to feel warm in a specific way, not the general warmth of a heated suit. A surface warmth on the skin. She looked at her suit reading. The temperature inside was normal. She pressed her fingers against the sleeve over the area that felt warm. The warmth was coming from the skin itself. She knew exactly what this was. She finished the survey quadrant. She logged all her samples correctly. She took the final 3 rock photographs she needed for the geological record. Then she walked back to the base shelter with the rest of the team at the end of the assigned surface period. When they got inside and the airlock cycled and Vale gave the all-clear to remove suits, Dana pulled off her helmet first, then her left glove. Then she unsealed the left sleeve and pulled it back. The skin on her forearm was red. Not slightly pink, red. The bright particular red of skin that has had something done to it. It ran from her wrist up to just below the elbow, and there were patches of it on the back of her hand and on the left side of her neck where the collar seal met the helmet ring. The skin was slightly raised in places and visibly warm, and when the cool, recycled air of the shelter hit it, Dana made a small, involuntary sound and pulled her arm against her chest for a moment. Fen saw it first. Fen was a Kasari, which meant he was small and gray and had eyes that were very large relative to his head and which were designed by evolution to detect extremely fine details at close range. What his enormous eyes detected right now was a coalition crew member with visible radiation damage across significant portions of exposed skin surface on a planet where unshielded UV exposure was classified in the medical literature as a precursor to fatal tissue cascade. The sound Fen made was not a word. It was a sound that came before words. It was the sound of a medical professional who has just seen something that every year of their training is telling them is the beginning of a very bad situation. His scanner was in his hand before he had decided to reach for it. He was already crossing the shelter floor. He was already talking fast in Kasari, and the translator was struggling to keep up, but the words that came through clearly were damage and exposure and tissue, an emergency. Dana looked at him coming toward her with the scanner up, and the enormous eyes wide, and the fast Kasari words tumbling out of him. She looked at her arm. The red arm. The arm that was warm and a little sore, and was going to be annoying for a few days, and would peel in about a week. She looked back at Fen. She said it simply, without urgency, without drama, with the particular calm of someone who has had this exact thing happen to them before, and knows exactly what it is and exactly what it is not. She told him to relax. She said it was just sunburn. Fen stopped moving. His scanner was still raised. His enormous eyes were still wide. He looked at her red arm, and he looked at her calm face, and he looked at her red arm again. The translator gave him the word sunburn, and he stood there holding it in his mind like an object he had never seen before and did not know how to put down. Outside, the 2 suns of Solara were still burning. They did not care. They had been burning for 4 billion years, and they intended to continue. Fen ran the scanner 3 times. The first time he did not believe it. The second time, he checked the calibration settings, because there was clearly something wrong with the device. The third time he stood very still and looked at the readings, and then looked at Dana's arm, and then looked at the readings again, and said nothing for a long moment. The scanner was not broken. The readings were correct. Surface tissue damage. Epidermal layer. Localized inflammatory response. Elevated skin. Temperature. No deeper penetration. No subdermal involvement. No cellular cascade beginning. No organ stress indicators. No radiation poisoning markers in the blood scan he ran automatically as part of the emergency protocol. The damage stopped. At the skin dot, it simply stopped there like something had put up a wall and said no further. Fen called Commander Vale over. with a gesture that was meant to be professional and calm and was neither of those things. Vale came across the shelter and looked at the scanner readings that Fen held up, and then looked at Dana's arm, and then stood very still in the way. Alrighty, stand still when their mind is processing something that does not fit into any existing category. Dana was sitting on a supply crate. She had found a ration bar somewhere and was eating it with the comfortable ease of a person having a normal evening. Her red arm rested on her knee. She had rolled her sleeve up to the elbow, and the redness was very visible in the shelter lighting. It looked exactly like what it was. It looked like what it looked like on every beach and every summer afternoon, and every rooftop in the history of human existence when someone stayed out too long. Sauce stood near the back wall. He was young, and this was only his second off-world mission, and he was looking at Dana's arm the way young crew members look at things that have not been covered in their training, which was with wide eyes and complete silence. Vale asked Dana what had happened. Dana explained about the suit. She explained about the UV membrane and the crack in the left sleeve seam. She said she had noticed it at the 60-minute mark when her arm started to feel warm. She said the temperature regulation was still working fine, so there was no alert. She said she had finished the survey quadrant because she was almost done, and there was no point stopping. Vale asked why she had not reported it immediately. Dana looked at him with an expression that was patient and slightly amused. She said because it was Sunburn, and she did not want to interrupt the survey over Sunburn. Fen made a small sound. Dana looked at him. Then she said all right and set down the ration bar and explained what Sunburn was. She explained it the way she would explain it to someone who had genuinely never encountered the concept. She explained that humans evolved on a planet with a star. One star, admittedly not two, but still a star and still direct solar radiation. She explained that early. Humans had no shelter and no suits and no UV membranes in anything. They had skin. Just the skin. And they stood in the sunlight and worked in the sunlight and lived in the sunlight for hundreds of thousands of years. She said the skin learned. She said, UV radiation hits the outer layer of skin cells and damages them, and the body responds by sending blood to the area to begin repair, and the blood near the surface is what makes the skin look red, and the inflammatory response is what makes it feel warm and sore. She said the damaged cells would die off over the next few days, and the skin underneath, which had been protected, would come to the surface. She said that new skin was often slightly more tan than before, which was the body producing more melanin as a shield for next time. She said the whole thing would be completely resolved in about a week. Fen had been listening to this with his scanner still in his hand and his large eyes tracking every word. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. Then he said he wanted to confirm one thing. He asked if she was telling him that the human body had a built-in response system for solar radiation damage that repaired the damage and then upgraded the skin to better handle the same damage in the future. Dana said yes. That was basically it. Fem looked at the scanner. He looked at the readings that showed no cascade, no poisoning, no deeper tissue involvement. He looked at Dana's arm, which on any other species in the room would have been the opening chapter of a very grim medical situation. He sat down. Vale asked Dana a question. He asked it carefully, as though he was not entirely sure he wanted the answer. He asked if this happened often. Dana thought about it. She said pretty much every summer when she was a child. She said her mother used to put a white cream on it, called sunscreen, which was meant to prevent it, but children, in her experience, did not stay still long enough for sunscreen to make much difference. She said she had probably had sunburn 30 or 40 times in her life. Sauce made a quiet sound from the back wall. It occurred to Vale that he should check the medical literature. He pulled up the human xenobiology file on his datapad. He searched for sunburn. He found it listed under common dermatological conditions. He read the entry. Then he followed a reference link at the bottom of the entry. The link took him to a document about something called tanning. He read the document. He read it again. Then he turned the datapad around and showed it to Fen. Fen, read it. The large eyes got larger. Fen looked at Dana. The document explained that humans had historically, and in many cultures deliberately, exposed their unprotected skin to direct solar radiation for the purpose of recreation and aesthetic preference. They went to locations specifically designed for this activity. Some of these locations involved large bodies of water and sand. They lay on the sand under the direct sun without UV protection for extended periods. On purpose, willingly, sometimes, for hours. They called it getting a tan. They considered the resulting darkened skin to be attractive. Some of them paid money to go to special, small rooms containing artificial UV lamps to receive the same effect indoors during seasons when the sun was less available. Vale put the datapad down on the equipment table. The shelter was completely silent, except for the sound of the ventilation system. Sauce looked at Dana with an expression that had moved past confusion into something closer to wonder. Fen looked at Dana with the expression of a medical professional whose entire foundation is cracking very slowly under his feet. Dana had picked up her ration bar again. She was aware they were all looking at her, and she had the particular expression of a human who knows they have caused this reaction and is not entirely sure whether to be amused or apologetic. Vale said the words slowly. He asked if he was understanding correctly. He said he was asking to confirm. He said the document suggested that humans went to special places and lay under direct stellar radiation on purpose, without suits, without shielding of any kind, and that they did this for enjoyment. Dana said yes. Vale asked if there was any health benefit involved. Dana said some vitamin D. She said mostly it was just nice. She said warm sun on your skin felt good. She said there was something about it that made people feel relaxed and happy. Vale looked at the Keth Solara UV index rating on his mission briefing document. He looked at the words classified as lethal to unshielded organic tissue. He looked at Dana's red arm. He looked at Dana's calm face. He said nothing. Fen said nothing. The ventilation system hummed. Dana finished her ration bar and said she was going to get some sleep and that someone should check the suit in Bay 3 because the UV membrane had a weak seam on the left sleeve and they should patch it before tomorrow. Then she stood up and walked to her bunk and lay down. The 3 aliens stood in the shelter and looked at the empty supply crate where she had been sitting and said nothing for a very long time. Fen did not sleep. This was not unusual for Fen in the way that not sleeping is unusual for most creatures. Fen had a particular relationship with night cycles, which was that he used them for thinking instead of resting, and then wondered in the morning why he felt tired. His colleagues on his homeworld had told him many times that this was not a healthy habit. He had agreed with them every time, and then continued doing it because the thinking would not stop, just because he told it to. Tonight the thinking was louder than usual. He sat at the small equipment table in the corner of the shelter, with his medical scanner and his datapad and 3 separate reference texts open at once, and he worked through the problem the way he worked through all medical problems, which was methodically and from first principles. He started with the UV index for Keth Solara. The dual star system produced a combined UV output that sat in the range his medical training described as extreme. The specific frequency bands that Keth Solara's suns produced in high quantities were the kind that penetrated organic tissue efficiently. Efficiently meaning they did not stop at the surface. They kept going. In the species Fen had trained on, they would pass through the outer skin layers and begin interacting with the cells underneath, and those cells would respond the way cells respond to damage, which was by dying and triggering a cascade of further damage, and that cascade, if not treated, would reach deeper and deeper tissue over a period of hours to days. He had seen it happen. He had treated it twice in his career. Both times it had been serious. One patient had recovered fully. One had not. The exposure Dana had received by his calculation was enough to have started that process in any other crew member. But the scanner had said no. The damage stopped at the surface, at the skin, as if the skin had looked at the incoming radiation and said, "This is mine to handle," and had handled it. Fen pulled up the xenobiological literature on human skin. He had read the summary before, but now he read everything. The full papers, the technical studies, the evolutionary biology sections he had skipped the first time because they were long. He read about melanin, about how human skin produced it in response to UV exposure, about how melanin molecules were extraordinarily effective at absorbing UV radiation and converting it into heat before it could damage the DNA of deeper cells, about how humans with more melanin in their skin had more of this protection naturally, and humans with less produced more in response to exposure. He read about the inflammatory response he had seen in Dana's arm, the redness, the warmth. He read that this was not damage trying to get worse. This was the body beginning repairs immediately. White blood cells, repair proteins, everything the body had for fixing damaged skin cells arriving at the site within minutes. He read about skin cell turnover, about how the outer layer of human skin renewed itself constantly, about how sunburn cells died and were replaced by new cells from below, about how the new cells were protected by the melanin response that had already been triggered. He read about sunscreen. He read about tanning. He read 3 separate papers on the evolutionary history of human skin and its relationship with solar radiation. And then he sat back and looked at the ceiling of the shelter and thought about what he had read. The human body had not simply survived a star. It had studied one. Over hundreds of thousands of years of direct unshielded daily exposure, it had developed a system that was layered and responsive and intelligent in the way biological systems become intelligent over a very long time. It detected the radiation. It absorbed it before it could go deep. It repaired the damage. It upgraded the defenses. And it did all of this automatically without the human having to think about it or ask for it. Dana had not survived today because she was tough. She had survived because her body had been paying attention to stars since before her species had words. He was still sitting with this thought when he heard movement behind him, and Dana came out of the bunk area. She was wrapped in a thermal sheet, and her red arm was visible below the edge of it, and she moved quietly the way people move when they are trying not to wake others. She stopped when she saw Fen at the table. She looked at him. She looked at the 3 open reference texts and the scanner and the expression on his face. She sat down across from him. She did not ask what he was reading. She could see what he was reading. She waited. Fen looked at her for a moment. Then he said that he had thought she was dying. He said it plainly because Fen did not have a mode for saying difficult things indirectly. He said that when he saw her arm, his entire 20 years of medical training had produced one clear signal, and the signal was that he was watching the early stages of fatal radiation damage in a crew member who did not know it yet. He said that his hands had been shaking when he ran the first scan. He said that the 90 seconds between running the scan and reading the results had been some of the worst 90 seconds of his recent career because he had been completely certain of what the results would say. He said he was embarrassed by how frightened he had been. Dana was quiet for a moment. Then she said she was sorry. She said she should have reported the suit malfunction. She said she had known what was happening, and she had not thought about how it would look to someone who did not know what Sunburn was, and she had been careless about that. Fen said she did not need to apologize for having durable skin. Dana almost smiled. Then she explained it fully. The real explanation, not the short version from earlier. She talked about human evolutionary history and direct solar exposure and the skin barrier system and the melanin response and the repair cycle. She explained it the way she explained geological processes, which was with genuine interest and the kind of detail that comes from a person who finds the subject worth thinking about. Fen listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, the thing that had been sitting in him since he read the last paper. He said her body had learned the sun. He said it carefully, like he was checking each word before he placed it. He said her species had spent so long under direct stellar radiation that the body had stopped treating it as an enemy and had built a working relationship with it instead. He said the skin did not just survive the sun. It used it. It responded to it. It remembered it. He said Dana's body had made peace with something that killed everything else. Dana looked at him. She said she had never thought about it like that. Fen said he had never thought about anything like that until tonight. There was a quiet between them that was comfortable rather than empty. The ventilation system ran. The shelter walls made small sounds in the night temperature drop outside. Then Fen said the other thing. The thing he had not told anyone. He said on his homeworld, Kesser, there was no surface sunlight. He said Kesser orbited its star at a distance and angle that meant the surface received only diffuse filtered light through a thick atmospheric layer. He said Kazari had evolved underground and moved to surface habitation relatively recently in their history, and even now the surface dwellings were heavily shaded, and the culture had a strong preference for interior spaces. He said the first time he came to space and stood in an observation deck with an unfiltered view of open stars, he had left the deck after 4 minutes because something old and deep in his body had become afraid. Not logically afraid. Not afraid because he had assessed a threat. Just afraid the way something becomes afraid when it encounters something so much larger than itself that it does not know what to do with the size of it. He said he had told no. This. He said a medic who was afraid of stars was not a detail he had ever wanted in his professional record. Dana said nothing for a moment. Then she said she understood. She said there were things humans were afraid of too that had no logic behind them. Deep water, heights, certain kinds of dark. She said fear did not need a reason. It just needed a long enough history. Fen nodded slowly. They sat together in the quiet of the shelter, on a world with 2 suns that were currently on the other side of the planet doing their patient, burning in the dark. Fen looked at Dana's red arm resting on the table. In the low light of the shelter, it had a faint warmth to it. Not sick warmth. Not the warmth of damage getting worse. The warmth of something being actively repaired. The warmth of a body doing exactly what it was built to do. He thought that in all his years of medicine, he had seen a great many things heal. He had never before thought of healing as something beautiful. He thought it now. The morning briefing was short and professional. Vale ran through the day. 2 survey assignments with the focused efficiency he used when he wanted the team to understand that yesterday was yesterday and today was work. Fen had patched the UV membrane on the suit from Bay 3 the previous night. He had actually patched all the suits. He had gone through every seal and every membrane and every collar ring with the careful attention of someone who had decided that no more surprises were acceptable on this particular mission. Dana thanked him for it. Fen said nothing. He handed her the suit and went back to his equipment check. Dana's arm was still red this morning. Slightly less bright than yesterday, but still clearly, they're still warm if you touched it. She put on her suit carefully and sealed it correctly. And when Vale asked before they stepped outside if all suit systems were reading green, she checked every single reading and confirmed yes before she answered. Vale noticed this. He did not comment on it. They went out onto the surface of Solara, and the two suns came up together over the eastern ridge and hit the pale rocks and turned everything a hard, bright white, and the survey team spread across the grid and went to work. The morning was clear. The UV index was high, but within the mission parameters. The suits performed correctly. Dana worked her quadrant with the same quiet efficiency as the day before. Vale found himself checking her suit telemetry more often than the others, which he was aware was not strictly necessary, but which he did anyway. By midday, they were ahead of schedule. Fen and Sauce had completed the Eastern Rock Formation survey entirely. The other two specialists had the Northern Ridge data logged and packaged. Dana had 3 more sample points in the Western Quadrant, and then the surface work would be done and they could spend the last day in the shelter processing data and preparing for departure. Then the storm came. It did not come with much warning. Solara's dual star system produced weather patterns that the forecasting models were still not fully accurate about because the interactions between the two stellar wind outputs created conditions that changed faster than the models predicted. The storm was on the edge of the sensor range at midday, and it was at the survey grid boundary by early afternoon, and it was overhead by the time the alarm sounded on every suit simultaneously. Radiation storm. Not wind, not temperature. A pulse of concentrated UV output pushed ahead of a charged particle front from the interaction zone between the two stellar winds. The kind of event that the mission briefing had listed under hazard conditions and described as requiring immediate shelter. Vale called the return immediately. All crew, full speed. 20 minutes to the shelter. The team moved. They were good at moving fast because Vale had made sure they practiced it. The two specialists on the Northern Ridge started back immediately. Fen turned from the Eastern Formation and began the return route. Dana was already moving from the Western Quadrant in long, fast strides that covered ground efficiently. Sauce was behind Fen. He was moving fast and he was watching the storm front, which was a visible thing now, a bright shimmering distortion in the upper atmosphere that made the already strange light of the dual suns into something almost painful even through a suit visor. He was watching it and not watching the ground, and the ground on Solara was not a ground that rewarded inattention. His right boot caught the edge of a rock formation that jutted up from the surface at an angle that was almost invisible in the flat overhead light. He went down fast and hard. He caught himself on his hands and knees, but the impact was sharp, and his right knee hit a second rock on the way down, and the sound that came through the cum was short and involuntary. Vale heard it. Everyone heard it. Sauce was already getting up. He said he was fine. He said it quickly in the way young crew members say they are fine when they are not entirely sure yet. He stood. He took 2 steps. He stopped. He looked down at his right knee. The suit was torn, not a large tear. A sharp rock edge had caught the outer layer at exactly the wrong angle and opened a gap about 4 centimeters long just below the right knee seal. The inner membrane was intact, but the UV shielding layer had separated from the outer fabric. The gap was open to the air of Solara. The storm front was 12 minutes away. Fen reached Sauce in 30 seconds. He looked at the tear. He looked at the storm distortion in the sky. He pulled an emergency seal strip from his kit and pressed it over the tear and held it, but the surface was not flat, and the strip was not making full contact, and he could already see that it was not going to hold for a 12-minute run back to the shelter. He told Vale on the come. He gave the information fast and clean the way medics give information, which was without panic and with all the relevant details. Vale said, "Get to the shelter." He said, "Do it now." They moved. Fen stayed close to Sauce. The emergency strip held partially. By the time they were 6 minutes from the shelter, the storm front Edge had reached them, and the UV index reading in Vale's suit jumped sharply, and the pale rocks around them seemed to brighten in a way that was not light exactly, but was the particular quality of radiation that you could not see, but that things could feel. Sauce's leg below the torn seal got 4 minutes of that exposure before they were inside, and the airlock cycled and the door sealed behind them. 4 minutes on. Kefsalara storm UV was not nothing. Fen had Sauce seated and the suit leg removed before the airlock had finished cycling. The skin below the torn seal was already showing it. Red, sharp-edged where the seal strip had held and had not held. The redness was bright and immediate the way radiation damage presented on Velhari's skin, which was faster and more visible than on most species. Sauce was looking at his leg. He was 18 months out of training. He had read the radiation damage protocols in the briefing documentation, but reading about something and seeing it on your own leg in the aftermath of a storm on a dual sun world were not the same experience. His breathing was audible on the come, even though they were inside now. Short and controlled in the way of someone who was holding something down. Fen was already running the scanner. Dana came and sat on the floor beside Sauce. She did not ask permission. She did not announce herself. She just sat down next to him, with her back against the equipment rack and her legs stretched out in front of her, and she waited until he looked at her dot. Then she rolled up her left sleeve. Her arm was still red. Less angry than yesterday, but clearly still there. The area across the forearm and the back of the hand still warm-looking and distinctly marked against the rest of her skin. She held it out so Sauce could see it clearly. She said she had gotten more than 4 minutes yesterday. She said Kefsalara had hit her for 90 minutes through a compromised UV membrane, and her arm had looked worse than his leg did right now. She said this without drama. Just a fact stated clearly for a specific purpose. She said she was fine. She said his body would do what it knew how to do, which was repair what needed repairing, and that Fen was going to help it along, and in a week. He would not remember which leg it had been. Sauce looked at her arm for a long time. Then he looked at his leg. Then back at her arm. His breathing slowed. Not all the way, but enough. Vale had been standing near the airlock watching. He watched. Dana showed Sauce her arm the way you show someone a map of territory they are frightened of and say, "Look, I have been there and I came back." He watched Sauce's breathing change. He watched Fen working with steadier hands because the patient was steadier. Then Vale did something he had not planned to do. He pulled up the suit telemetry log from yesterday. He had been meaning to look at it since last night, and he had not gotten to it, and something about this moment made him look at it now. He found Dana's suit data from the survey day. He found the UV shielding membrane reading. He found the timestamp when it had begun degrading. He did the math he should have done last night. He stood very still. The crack in the membrane had not started at the 40-minute mark. The crack had been there from the beginning. The degradation had been gradual, and the readings had not triggered an automatic alert because each individual reading was below the threshold. But the cumulative exposure from the beginning of the surface period to the time Dana had returned to the shelter was not 90 minutes of partial shielding. It was 90 minutes at a degradation curve that by the end of the period had reduced her UV protection to roughly 40% of rated capacity on a storm level. UV day. 40% protection against Kefsalara full dual sun output was not 40% safety. The UV index relationship was not linear. At 40% shielding, you were not 60% exposed. You were exposed to a radiation load that Vale's calculations now told him was equivalent to roughly the same category as the storm exposure. That had just damaged Sauce's leg through a 4-centimeter gap. Except for 90 minutes instead of 4. Vale looked at Dana sitting on the floor next to Sauce, showing him her arm. He looked at her calm face. He looked at her red arm that she had described as annoying and that would peel in a week. He looked at the numbers on his datapad. He looked at Dana. Again. He walked slowly across the shelter and stood near her. He did not say anything. He simply stood there holding the datapad with the numbers on it that he did not know how to give a name to. Dana looked up at him. She read his face the way she seemed to read most thin. The mission ended on schedule. 72 hours on the surface of Keth Solara, not 73. Vale had checked the mission clock on the final morning, and the team had packed and prepped and loaded the survey data and walked up the ramp into the transport ship with the two suns burning behind them and the pale sharp rocks of Keth Solara reflecting the light back at the sky, the way they had been doing for 4 billion years before any of them arrived and would continue to do long. After Dana was last up the ramp. She stopped at the top and turned around. She looked back at the survey site, the sample markers still in the ground, the equipment scars in the pale rock from 3 days of geological work, the slow shimmer of heat rising from the surface in the late morning light. She looked at it for about 10 seconds in the way people look at places they have worked and found worth working in. Then she walked inside and the ramp closed. The Coalition medical frigate that had brought them to Keth Solara was in orbit 2 hours above the surface. The transport docked smoothly and the team transferred through to the main ship and were taken directly to the medical bay for the standard post-surface health check that was mandatory after any Keth Solara assignment. The medical bay on the frigate was clean and well-lit and had the slightly institutional quality of rooms that existed purely to keep bodies functioning correctly. The ship's medical AI ran the full workup on each crew member in sequence. Sauce went first because of the storm exposure. The AI assessed the radiation damage to his leg and classified it correctly and prescribed the standard Valhari dermal treatment. An estimated full recovery in 11 days. Then it was Dana's turn. The eye ran its scan. It processed the results. It cross-referenced her skin readings against the human xenobiological database. It generated its report in 3 seconds. The report classified Dana's condition as minor surface radiation exposure. No treatment required. Recommend standard moisturizing compound for comfort. Full resolution expected within 7 to 10 days. The medic on duty was a young T3 named Arisis, who had been certified for 6 months and was still in the phase of her career where she read every report carefully before accepting it. She read this one. She looked at Dana's arm. She looked at the Keth Solara UV data attached to the mission file. She read the report again. Then she looked up at Dana and asked if she wanted the moisturizing compound. Dana said yes, please. Arisis applied it without further comment because the report said what the report said and her job was to follow the report. But she watched Dana leave the medical bay with the expression of someone who's encountered a gap between what they expected and what they found and has decided to think about it later when they are somewhere quiet. Vale filed his mission report. That evening, in his cabin, he was an efficient report writer. He had been writing mission reports for 19 years, and he had developed a style that was clear and organized and contained exactly what was required and nothing that was not. Incident descriptions, data summaries, equipment performance notes, crew performance assessments. He could produce a clean report on a straightforward survey mission in about 40 minutes. He had been sitting at his desk for 2 hours. The problem was the section titled Notable Incidents. He had written it 4 times. Each time he wrote the correct version, the professional version. Suit malfunction in Survey Unit 1. UV membrane degradation. Crew member exposed to elevated radiation levels. Crew member unharmed. Equipment logged for repair. Each time he read it back, he deleted it because it was accurate. And it was completely wrong at the same time. It described what happened the way a description of a river describes water moving from one place to another. True. Present. Missing the entire point. He opened the mission file and pulled up his calculations from the shelter, the UV index numbers, the membrane degradation curve, the cumulative exposure figure, the storm level equivalents. He looked at them for a long time. Then he started writing the real report. He wrote everything. He wrote it in the careful, organized language of a commander who needed the people reading this to understand it correctly. He wrote about the membrane crack and the exposure duration and the calculation he had done. He wrote the number clearly in its own line with the UV equivalents beside it so that whoever read this would understand what that number meant without having to look it up. He wrote about Dana sitting on the supply crate, eating a ration bar. He wrote about the scanner readings that Fenn had run 3 times. He wrote about the tanning document and the silence in the shelter. He wrote about Sauce on the floor of the shelter with his leg exposed, and Dana sitting beside him and rolling up her sleeve and saying nothing except, "I had more than that, and I am fine." He wrote that the human crew member had at no point during the mission displayed any behavior that suggested she understood her situation to be remarkable. He wrote that she had described her condition accurately using her own species terminology. He wrote that her own species terminology for this condition was a single common word that suggested something minor and temporary and entirely ordinary. He wrote that the word was correct. He wrote that this was the part he wanted the coalition Xenobiological Division to read carefully. He wrote that the injury was classified as minor, not because the human was exceptional among humans. He wrote that it was classified as minor because human biology had decided somewhere in its long history that this specific type of damage from this specific type of source was not going to be allowed to be serious. He wrote that this was not toughness. He wrote that toughness was a quality applied to things that endured force. What he had observed was different. What he had observed was a species that had been in direct relationship with stellar radiation for so long that the fatias with the radiation had stopped being a force applied to them and had become a thing they had absorbed and metabolized and made into something useful. He wrote that he had looked up the evolutionary timeline before writing this report. He wrote that humans have been standing unshielded under their star for approximately 300,000 years. He wrote that 300,000 years was enough time to have a very thorough conversation with something. He wrote that it appeared they had. He added a note at the bottom of the report. He wrote that the coalition medical literature currently described human radiation tolerance as an anomaly. He wrote that he wanted to formally request that the word anomaly be reviewed. He wrote that an anomaly was something that occurred outside of a pattern. What he had observed was not outside of a pattern. It was the pattern. It was the result of a pattern so long and so consistent that calling it anomalous was like calling a mountain anomalous because most rocks were not that tall. He submitted the report. Then he stood up from his desk and walked to the observation deck. Dana was already there. She was standing at the far end of the deck with her arms resting on the rail and her face toward the viewport. Outside the viewport, the stars were sharp and cold, and still the way stars look from orbit, where there is no atmosphere to blur their edges. Keth Solara was visible below them, a pale disk with the faint shimmer of its radiation field visible. At the upper atmosphere, where the 2 stellar winds pressed in, its 2 suns were off to the side, 2 small burning points that did not look threatening from up here. From up here, they looked almost modest. Fenn was there too. He was standing a few feet from Dana, also looking out. He had been standing there for some time by the look of him. He had his arms loose at his sides, and his large eyes were directed at the viewport, and he was not doing the thing he usually did when he looked at open space from observation decks, which was standing slightly too straight and breathing slightly too carefully. He was just standing there. Mail came and stood nearby. and did not interrupt whatever was happening in the quiet between them. After a while, Fen said something. He said it quietly, and Vale almost did not hear it. He said he had been afraid of stars his whole life. He said it simply, past tense. Dana did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the viewport. She said she knew. A silence. Long and easy. Then Fen said he was not sure he was afraid anymore. He said it the way someone says something that surprises them slightly as it comes out. Like the thought had finished forming and arrived as a sentence before he had fully checked it. Dana said nothing for a moment. She watched the two small burning points of the Solar sun sitting steady in the dark. Then she said the thing that had been true all along. The thing that her body had known for 300,000 years before she was born. She said it the way humans say true things, which was quietly and without announcement and without any apparent awareness that it was the kind of sentence that could rearrange something in the person who heard it. She said they were just suns. She said they were warm, if you let them be. Fen stood with those words for a moment. Then something in him settled. Something old and underground and Khazari that had spent a very long time deciding that stars were threats slowly considered the possibility that it had been wrong. He looked at the viewport. He did not look away. Vale stood behind them both and looked at the human woman leaning on the rail with her red arm visible below her rolled sleeve and the stars reflected in the viewport in front of her and the two suns of a world that should have hurt her burning small and quiet in the distance. He, though,